Hello, I'm Doug, and welcome to the Krewe Japan podcast, a weekly podcast where we take you on audio journeys through Japanese culture. Welcome back to the podcast. Today we're talking about the national drink of Japan, sake. That's right, sake to me, baby. Ever wonder about the right way to sip on sake? Or perhaps you want to know a little bit more about what goes into the process of making your favorite bottle of rice wine? Well, we were incredibly fortunate to be joined by Brian Ashcraft, the author of an award-winning The Japanese Sake Bible, to talk about all things sake. So break out your finest daiginjo, sit back, and enjoy. All right. Hey, everybody. It's Doug, and today we have with us Nigel. What's up, bud?
Hey, what's up, man?
Not too much. You know, the other day, I actually I was taking my son to the Children's Museum to meet up with some friends, and they have a little cafe next door. And at the cafe, you know, and don't judge because this is New Orleans, and we have alcohol everywhere. But at the cafe next door to the Children's Museum, I noticed they had some canned alcohol, but at first I thought it was like beer or some kind of like seltzer, hard seltzer or something. Then I looked at it and I was like, no, that's sake. And it's actually, turns out it is a sake called Wetland Sake, which is a local New Orleans sake brewery. Did you know they had one?
No, actually, and I'm like really shocked to actually hear that. It just doesn't seem like New Orleans is the place where I usually see a lot of people drinking sake. So it's interesting that there's, someone came up with the idea, to actually start their own brewery here and kind of, I guess really start that interest in it.
Yeah, I was not really the first thing I was expecting to see in like the line of here's our alcohol for you to drink while your children are playing.
Yeah,
it was I was thinking beer or whatever, if anything. But sake was definitely not something I expected to see, and after doing some investigation, or not really investigation, but looking into it, it's kind of cool. I mean, they follow a lot of the same processes they do for making sake in Japan, but also they actually use local short grain rice that is made at LSU Agricultural School.
Oh, that's actually really cool. Wow.
Yeah, it's made specially for this brewery.
Whoa, wow.
So it's really, really neat. I think they still have like Rouse's, so I'm gonna have to go. Or maybe if not there, then they definitely have it at some like, liquor shops and stuff. So I'll have to check it out. But, are you much of a sake drinker?
So, admittedly, I'm not, but I have a, huge interest in learning more about it and actually, getting into, learning the history of it as well. But in terms of actually drinking it and being a connoisseur,
no,
absolutely not. How about you?
I think I had it when I went on study abroad. I can't tell you the first time, although I know that on New Year's during my study abroad year, there was a drinking game at my dorm on New Year's Eve for all the people who hadn't gone back home. Because on New Year's, and we kind of talked about this in our holiday episode, of everybody kind of mass exiting from Tokyo to like their hometowns and whatnot to go stay with family. But for those that didn't do that, or maybe didn't want to, they had some other responsibilities in Tokyo. They stayed in at the dorm, and they would have like a big New Year's drinking party. And I definitely had sake that night, and then I definitely had other things mixed with sake, including red wine and beer and octopus, and a lot of mixtures. It was like one of those what they call batsu game, where it's you just drink. If you lose the drinking game, you have to drink that, and it definitely wasn't a great experience. It actually scarred me for red wine for like a decade. I didn't drink red wine for like 10 years after that because I just had a really bad experience that night and then the next morning. But back to sake. I mean, I just remember them pouring the entire bottle of this like New Year's sake into this giant mug and then pouring beer into it. I'm sure it's not the best way to enjoy your sake. But that was one of my earliest experiences with it. unfortunately wasn't in its truest form. But so what about you, Nigel? How about you? Do you have a fun sake experience you want to share from your time in Japan?
So I don't know if it really qualifies as fun, but actually the first time I actually had sake was like you, also in Japan before it was in the US. So the first time I had it was again also like you on a study abroad experience. And for me, one night, a couple of my classmates and I, we had to watch a film. And I think the film, it's hard to remember. It's quite a few years ago, but I think it was a 1950s Japanese film called Crazed Fruit. If anyone who's in the class with me remembers and is listening to this, please let me know. But I think that was it. But it's crazy. It was like a coming of age beach movie in the like set in the 50s in Japan. Really, really wild. A lot of teenage angst and trapped, feelings, trapped in a society, rebuilding post World War II. All this stuff going on. And somebody had the idea, hey, let's go pick up some sake and watch this movie. So we're all sitting actually in my dorm room watching this movie, and it's like 13 of us, like all just sitting in there like, what are we watching and sipping on sake? So that was kind of like my first experience. And then from there, over my time studying abroad, I would try different places that we would go to. But like you, I couldn't tell you the name of a single sake that I tried. And I wish that were different.
Yeah.
I wish I could have somehow captured the name or knew more about it then. But unfortunately, can't go back in time. So the first experience though would be in a dorm room with classmates watching Crazed Fruit. So weird. Again, I don't know if that's funny, but
no, I mean it's you remember it though. That's the thing.
Yeah,
like that was your first try. Maybe not first try, but your memorable try, right?
Yeah, definitely.
It is a national drink in Japan for a reason. I mean, obviously, beer is probably one of the most popular drinks in Japan, but sake is that national treasure of a drink in that it started in Japan, and the historical aspects of it. I mean, there are breweries that go back centuries, and I'm not talking about like 1 or 2 or 3 centuries. I'm talking about like more than 5 or 6 centuries. Like they're old breweries that have been around for a long time. So there's a lot of history that goes into sake. And I don't really know too much about the history, or I didn't until I, being on Twitter a lot for the podcast and working on there, I kind of see a lot of the other Twitter folks out there. And one of the people that I interacted with on there was Brian Ashcraft, and he had written a book called The Japanese Sake Bible. And I decided one day to pick it up and kind of look into it because I was interested in learning a little bit more. And man, that book is so thorough. If you wanted to know something about sake, any aspect when it comes to whether it's about the process itself to make it, like the koji spores that they use to for part of the production, or even just the types of rice versus the types of water, or just like here's some great brands and good pairings for those. I mean, this book does everything. It's like an encyclopedia of sake. It's fantastic. So if you ever have an interest, I mean, that is a book. You've kind of you thumbed through it before, right? You've seen it. You've read through some parts.
Yeah. So I actually came across it by going through my local library. I actually went there one day and was looking for books on sake, and the librarian actually recommended it to me.
Oh, really?
I don't know if they've ever read it, but it was kind of with the name the Japanese Sake Bible. It's like it comes across as the definitive book on sake. So I don't know if they read it or they saw that in the system and they said, oh well, you have to start with this one. But great recommendation. So I checked it out. I haven't finished it yet, but I've gotten through enough of it that I can tell you it's a great book.
Yeah.
And it is super useful.
I mean, some of the stories in there were just fantastic. And we're going to cover this in our interview with Brian that we're going to have coming up in a few minutes, because he was super generous and willing to come on to the podcast to talk about, sake in general and kind of help shine some light on the processes and just the history behind it. As also his story going to Japan, which I always really find interesting.
Yeah, same.
Like that book, man, it's so cool. Like some of the stories they talk about, like the history and like how the breweries have passed down within families and stuff. It's just, really fascinating. And it's kind of, we've mentioned it before. Like a lot of times in Japan, like people who specialize in a certain area, like they do it to like the T, like it's not only just a specialization, but it's like to perfection. Like the sushi chefs, they have to cut the sushi like the right angle, like they do it, like prepare it the right way.
The amount of training that goes into, just being able to, shape the rice, and things like that. It can take years for you to get to that level. And certain levels of making sushi as well. So yeah, it's same, very similar experience with like sake.
Yeah. I mean, and it's just, I know when I can't, I mean, I'm not a very refined palate I don't have a refined palate when it comes to sake. If I go to a store, I'm looking at a bunch of bottles. I'm like, all right, which one looks the prettiest? Like, that's a cool looking bottle. I'm gonna get that one.
Yeah.
I look for the eye candy. I don't really know what goes into it.
Yeah.
So, or I've been to drinking parties where, someone breaks out a bottle of sake, and I don't know how to read the kanji. I don't know how to read what's on there. So I'll have something and it tastes delicious. I have no idea what I had, and I'll never know what I had. Like it's one of those mysteries of the earth. So, that's my experiences with sake just in general, or just been at those types of parties. And I wish I knew more about it at the time to kind of understand what type of sake I was drinking, or, like what the name was even, or, because there are different types of sake that are made in different parts of the country. Right. Depending on, and sometimes the water that's used is just, it's water from like, kind of how like Abita Brewery here uses, the Abita Springs water for their beer. It's kind of like that, like you can't make that beer anywhere else. Same thing with a lot of these sakes. They can't make, some of them outside of the area where that brewery is located. You can't reproduce it.
Yeah. So, I mean, like all of these things and more, we actually touch on in our interview that's coming up shortly. And it's great because Brian is a fantastic writer and has a great way of putting all this into a nice package and explaining sake to you in a way that just makes sense. And Brian himself is also super, super fascinating.
And have you ever been to a sake brewery before?
No, but I want to go to the one you mentioned in New Orleans. We need to.
We need to check that one out.
Yeah, maybe we can do a special project with them in the future if you're listening.
We'll have to send Wetlands this podcast.
Yeah,
and say, hey,
yeah. So if you're listening, maybe we're teasing out some future content for you there.
Yeah, get in touch. Shoot us an email at crewofjapanpodcast@gmail.com. All right. Well, let's get to the real, what everyone's here for. They're not here to listen to us talk. They want to hear Brian's insight. And we have a really awesome and great conversation with Brian. It was a lot of fun. And again, very thankful for him to come on and share some of his knowledge, talk about his book, talk about sake, talk about his experiences in general. I think everyone really enjoy it. And please feel free to reach out to us and give us feedback. And if you want to hear more about sake, let us know. We'll be loving to share that with you. So let's just jump on into the interview. All right. So today we have with us a very special guest, the senior editor of Kotaku and an author of plenty books, one of which is a recently published Japanese sake Bible, Brian Ashcraft. Welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you. Thank you for joining us. So let's just jump right on in. Would you like to take a second to introduce yourself for those who may not be familiar with you and your work?
So my name is Brian. I I've been writing for Kotaku, which is a video game culture site, since around 2005. And I also am a columnist at the Japan Times. And I've written a number of books on a variety of topics, whether that's been Japanese tattoos, Japanese whiskey, and most recently, Japanese sake. And I like sake very much, and I'm happy to talk about it.
Awesome. Well, we're happy to have you here to talk about it.
Great.
So before we jump into the sake topic and a little bit more about you, one thing we ask a lot of our guests when they join us for our podcast interviews is if they have a connection to New Orleans, and if they do, to share that. Now, you're from Texas, which is literally next door to us. And, have you ever been to New Orleans before?
I have.
You have?
Yeah, I have.
Okay.
And I actually have, I don't know, I guess somewhat of a, I don't want to say it's a deep connection to New Orleans, but I do have a connection. And I mean, that's where I went, for example, for my honeymoon.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
With my wife. My mom, as a kid, would often talk about when she went to New Orleans and she went to Commander's Palace, and Sidney Poitier was there, and she got his autograph. And so
cool.
When I was a kid, we went to New Orleans, and then we went to Commander's Palace, and she kept asking the waiter, is anyone famous here?
That's great.
And the waiter was like, no. Besides that, one of the first kind of like really big features that I did when I was a senior contributing editor at Wired Magazine was about absinthe. And I interviewed a researcher who had reverse engineered and then started making absinthe, and he was based out of New Orleans.
Okay.
So I flew actually in from Japan to New Orleans for like a 3-day weekend.
That's brutal.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's pretty intense.
It's a long trip.
It was very intense.
More time on the plane than actually in New Orleans, huh?
Well, yeah, pretty much. But the thing that made it extra kind of brutal was it was a 3-day weekend, and I'm interviewing this guy about absinthe. So most of the weekend was drinking a lot of absinthe as well. So it was just like I'm amazed that I finished the interview. But yes, I do have a connection with New Orleans, and I'm very fond of the city. I'm very fond of Louisiana.
That's great. Well, next time you're in town, just give us a ring. We'd love to take you out for some absinthe or some whiskey or sake or whatever.
I will.
Yeah. And if you don't mind me asking, when was the last time you actually visited?
I haven't been for a number of years. I've been to. I went to Louisiana fairly recently. I went up to Cadeau Lake.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So it was like kind of a family. We, in December when I was in Texas, we wanted to kind of go somewhere that was outdoors and socially distanced and safe. I do love Louisiana.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. Well, like Doug said, we can't wait to welcome you here and take you around and treat you to some absinthe and some beignets. That's our usual
famous people for you at Commander's Palace too.
Yeah. We'll work on that one.
You can find any like Academy Award winners.
Oh yeah.
We'll work on that.
No guarantees. So we always love hearing about, the New Orleans connections, but usually from there we kind of pivot to your journey to Japan. And if I'm not mistaken, you've been living in Japan for nearly 20 years now.
Right. This is my 20th year.
This is your 20th year. Wow. Awesome. So you can look back on, 20 years ago, you arrived in Japan. Mm-hmm. What actually brought you there? What motivated you to actually travel to Japan in the first place?
So, I mean, as a little kid, I was kind of always interested in Japan, and was just kind of interested. And then I think for a lot of, I'm in my early 40s, so I think a lot of kids or people, not kids anymore, adults, middle-aged men, my age. Growing up in the 80s, you just have, I think because of kind of the culture and because of the products and things that Japan made at that time, I think it's just natural for people to have an interest in Japan. And so I wanted to, go, and the idea was to stay for a short period of time, and that has turned into a long period of time.
That's how it works, right?
Funny, yeah, funny how life is. But yeah, I mean that's kind of the abridged answer. But yeah, I was just kind of interested as a kid. At one point when I was a child, I was like trying to follow like Japanese baseball,
Right.
which is hard to do in Texas when there's not the internet.
Yeah. Things we take for granted for $500.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's still pretty hard now. I think like the one of the only ways you can really stream it here is through DAZN, I think.
Oh wow.
Oh,
Yeah. So I mean, like, there's just like a bunch of things like that. I mean, of course, there's like video games when I was a kid. When I was really small, there was another kid in my class who had moved from Japan. So the teacher was like, "Hey, we're gonna like learn about Japan." So we learned about Japan for like a week, and then our teacher took us to a Japanese restaurant. And I remember the first time that I had miso soup at that restaurant, and it really kind of put Japan uh, on the map in like a very tangible, real way, And I was like, wow, I'd never had this. I'd never had these flavors before, and this soup was like so delicious, and I loved it. So there's a lot of things like that. I mean, one of our really close family friends was a flight attendant. She flew DFW to Narita, so she was always bringing back kind of snacks from Japan. So it just seemed from a very early age that I was aware of this place. They made, Voltron and video games and all this kind of stuff, but they also played like Cecil Fielder, the great Detroit Tiger, like went there and became an amazing baseball player. So they played baseball, and like, I was like, wow, I should, I'm really interested in this place. And I just ended up started getting a lot of like writing jobs, and then I got married and bought a home and had 3 children. Just a dog, and it just happens. It just kind of
1 year
up.
turns to 2 and 2 year turns to 20, huh?
Correct.
Wow. So
Correct.
you started getting the writing gigs. So did you at some point set out like in your head that you were going to be a writer based in Japan, or did it just kind of organically happen that way?
I mean, it did kind of. I'd always like since I was maybe in junior high school, I'd always thought like if I could get paid to write as a job, that would be the most amazing job. And I think maybe in high school, I was like, I want to write movies or like whatever, or something like that. But I knew I just wanted to write, and so there's just endless things to write about in Japan. So it just kind of I just started getting more and more work, and it was on a bunch of different topics. So it was just very, very interesting to me, and I like I like doing like really deep dives on stuff where you kind of get in on something for several years and really get into it inside out. And it's just been there's been a number of topics here which have kind of aligned with interests that I've had previously, and it just kind of worked out that way. Thank goodness. So
Yeah. So that's a good point. So you've written for Kotaku, Wired, the Japan Times,
mhm.
and a lot of that, writing by by nature of the sources that it appears in has to be a little bit shorter. But when did you decide to go down that route of really doing the deep dives and getting into the more long form nonfiction writing?
So a friend of mine who lived in Tokyo at the time said that he had met like a book editor at a party, and he's like, "Do you have any ideas for a book?" And I said, "Yes, I do." So that became a book on arcade games, and then it just kind of like, once you do one, it kind of picks up speed. But when I was when I was in college, or starting when I was a senior in high school, maybe it was a junior high school, starting when I was in high school, every summer I'd go out to Los Angeles and I'd intern in the movie business. And so this was the mid to late 90s. And I ended up interning at a company that was headed up by Quentin Tarantino. And his company, they were like releasing movies. And I was hired to work on a book. And I was hired because the guy who was running the company used to work at the video store with Tarantino, and he was a big movie nerd. And he wanted to find somebody who could do like kind of research and like stuff and help with this book. And so I'm a huge movie nerd, and I was a big enough movie nerd to impress my boss. And he's like, "Wow, this kid's a really big nerd. Knows a lot about cinema." And so they hired me, and so I worked on that book. And it was funny because I went out to LA to think that I would learn the movie business, but I actually learned a lot about how to put together a book. And those kind of skills I still use today, and that experience was huge for me, especially because of my age and just kind of the people I met and the things that had happened, and at that point I didn't think like, oh, I'm going to do, because that book was nonfiction and it was a series of interviews, and I'd go to some of the interviews, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But at that point I didn't think like, I'm going to write books. But when I started doing the arcade book, it didn't feel, the experience was like, oh, this was like when we did that. It didn't seem, and I was just like kind of an intern on that book, just helping with stuff, but it didn't seem completely foreign. And then that just kind of, then the one, led into the next one, the next one, the next one. And when you start doing like books, you obviously do a lot more research, and you do one and you're like, well, I did a lot of research on that book. And then you do the next book and you're like, well, I did even more on that. And then, by the time I got to the tattoo book, I'm like reading 300 or 400 books on this huge variety of topics. And then you get to the next book and you just kind of,
you can try to outdo yourself, right? You're like, I need to go further than I did last time.
Right. And you just kind of like push yourself in that regard. So, and you just want to get better at it. So that's kind of how, but Nigel, that was an excellent question. I hadn't really thought about that. Thank you.
Well, I quick follow up to that. Did you major in film, like in undergrad, or?
No, I did art history.
Art history. Okay, I majored in film.
Oh, so wow.
Yeah, well, that kind of brings us to your most recent book, the Japanese Sake Bible. Were you sitting on this idea? I know you mentioned that sake was a huge something you enjoyed and love.
Mm-hmm.
Was that something you've been sitting on the idea of writing this book for a while, or did you I guess, how did you track your thoughts to get to the point where you're like, I should turn this into a book? Like, were you keeping like a journal or something like for everything you drank and tried?
So when I was like a kid, so like both my parents enjoyed drinking. so the both of them, so like sometimes it'd be like, we're going on vacation to Napa Valley, and it's like I'm 8, but they enjoyed having a drink. And so in the family's kind of wet bar up on the shelves, and it's still like this hasn't changed in my my family home in Texas. There's a huge German beer stein that my mom had purchased when she lived in Germany, and then it was next to like a small sake set. And she had started drinking sake in like the 70s. And so she had just kind of liked sake, and there was kind of a mini sake boom at that time. And I just remember as a kid, kind of looking at that contrast, and if you look at a beer stein, you kind of have an idea, like, little kids kind of have an idea maybe of what beer tastes like because they see, Brom Bones and like a Disney cartoon, sloshing around beer. It's like frothy, and you imagine that it tastes like root beer. It doesn't, but that's what you imagine. But sake was like, what's this? It's clear. The cups are very small, and it was just a very striking contrast. So I was always kind of interested in sake. And then when I moved to Japan, I didn't have any money, and I would go to the convenience store a lot, and I would buy packets of natto to eat because there was a protein in there and I wouldn't die. And
brave man.
Yeah, so I'd get that, but there was always like cup sake. And so I was like, oh, what's this? It's like, it's sake, and it's in a cup, and you get to keep the cup, and the cup it's a glass cup. Nice, I can use that later. So I started drinking cup sake, and I really liked it. But around 2005, as we're mentioning, this connects to New Orleans. When I was working on that piece for Wired, I started really to get interested in the production of alcohol. And so I started going to sake breweries. around then. And I remember the first sake brewery I went to, and it's a brewery called Ume no Yado, and it's in Nara, and just being blown away. You know, you go into a brewery and you just get hit with the smell of sake, being made, being brewed, and it's I think it's a it's a wonderful smell. And then you see people turning rice into this delicious beverage, and that just blew my mind. I mean, it still blows my mind. How the whole the process behind it is nothing short of magical. And I remember one of the brewers, and this was 2005, so my Japanese wasn't where it was now, and my knowledge of sake obviously wasn't where it was now. And just I remember the brewer trying to explain to me the brewing process, and like my head just like exploding. I was like, "Holy cow, what is this?" And at that point, I got even further interested in sake. But at that time, I didn't think I'm going to do a book about this. It just happened. I ended up doing books that kind of worked in order. It's like, this is the time for me to do this. And when I did a book on Japanese whiskey. And when I was doing that, the whole time I was thinking like, this is interesting to look at a drink that's foreign and how it becomes Japanese. I want to also do a deep dive on sake, which is this kind of very Japanese drink, and for me that'll just be an interesting contrast. And then coming from writing about Japanese whiskey in depth, they're different drinks, but I thought it would be it would be coming from an interesting place, which is why I really wanted to do it. And then the timing just seemed right. There's a lot of interesting things going on in the industry at the moment, and I really wanted to get involved with that.
That's great. And the book itself is amazing. I really enjoyed it. Still enjoying it. I'm not fully finished, but I've read through quite a bit of it. But yeah, that's so cool. I like hearing what goes into it. Like the interest and how it develops, and how you can change an interest in something into something tangible, like an in-depth deep dive tangible object like a book, and have that history all, and be like, I did that. Like, I compiled something that maybe not many people have compiled before. This is my baby.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think my big problem is that I'm super obsessive about things. So if I I was like this when I was a little kid. So it's like I get into baseball, and it's like I'm not kind of into baseball. It's like I'm like really into it, and just obsessively so. And I remember as a kid I got into like autographs at one point, and it's like I'm not going to try to get like just Joe Schmo celebrity autographs. It's like I'm writing letters to like Rosa Parks and Henry Kissinger and like Sandra Day O'Connor and so like it's like I'm going to try to get as many amazing things as possible. And I remember I was just spending all my allowance on stamps. And when you're like a little kid sending a letter to like Henry Kissinger or something, like you're like a weird little kid, and so it's like always kind of been that way. It's like if I'm going to if I'm going to study a subject, I'm just going to go as deep as I possibly can. And so the books have been a really good opportunity for me to do that. And then at the end to say like that it wasn't like I'm it's like I have something to show for it at the
Yeah.
very least,
Yeah, no, honestly, I think like the rest of us, we owe a debt to people like you, though, because if you didn't have somebody doing these deep dives, then for a lot of us, we wouldn't even know about these subjects in depth. We'd know it on the surface, but it takes somebody like you that has that interest, to really push it, far, and to teach us something. So that's really awesome, and it probably all started with that Sidney Poitier autograph. Huh?
yeah. At least the autograph thing, because I think my mom has. But yeah, so I mean, it's a good time. It seemed like also like a really good time now for sake. There's a lot of The other thing that really kind of interests me is that there's a lot of good sake, really good sake being made internationally. There's a lot of good sake, really good sake being made in America and other countries as well. So I really felt like here's this drink that for most of its history outside of Japan has been kind of relegated to this kind of like periphery, you know, and it's like a drink that you have when people just think, oh, this is a, you know, you go to a Japanese restaurant, you get sake, but if you know when you drink sake, it's such a great, delicious beverage that it feels like it's being slighted. It feels like that as a drink, as a style of alcohol, that it has a rightful place next to beer and wine and whiskey, and is, I think, ultimately is such a great drink that it's even like, I'd say even bigger than Japan. You know, I think obviously Japan is its home, and there's a lot of connection. Obviously, just I mean, it's you know, this is a drink that Japan invented, but just like you know other alcoholic beverages, you know, wine is like bigger than any one country, right? And I feel that sake uh, is good, is such a great drink that I would say that it deserves that as well. I mean, it should be truly an international beverage. So I just kind of my goal, and then my co-author Eguchi-san, our goal for the book was really to kind of try to create a book where you know people can obviously learn about its strong connection, strong and but also kind of talk about going forward about how you know the drink is becoming more international and things like that. So that was the thing that really was interesting to me, and it's I do hope that you know when people drink sake that they don't just kind of limit it to like, oh, now I'm having Japanese food so I'll get sake. It's like, no, I mean, I'm having a Mexican food, you know, sake works really great with that, or I'm having you know this grilled meat or whatever. I'm eating these like you know really stinky British cheeses and stuff like that. You know, like all these different things that sakes work so well with. That the drink at this point is kind of on the precipice of kind of making these moves. And obviously, Japan and Japanese sake is always going to be kind of the origin, and that you know that kind of institutional knowledge here is invaluable. But I think it's great to see people outside the country really kind of get in there and say like, we want to make sake as well. And the reaction even within Japan to when they try a lot of these really well made foreign sakes is like, wow, this is really good, you know. So I think everyone kind of sees how that's beneficial.
Yeah, yeah, no, totally agree. And it seems like each year, you know, it's definitely crossed more into the international market, at least in the United States. I feel that presence, for sure. Part of I think feeling comfortable with the drink is also knowing the process of how it's made and knowing what goes into the labor of it. So you know, in your book, you actually break down the process of making sake step by step, from the types of rice used, the type of water, the komodo, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But for our listeners who are unfamiliar with the whole process, could you describe it in a way that for a beginner would make sense?
So I would say that I think maybe kind of the easiest way to talk about like the sake making process uh, uh, in a way that people can kind of understand it is that maybe to talk about kind of some certain assumptions that people often get. And the assumptions that people often bring to the table, especially in an international audience, is going to be wine. And so they're going to come to it, and you know, for wine, we have all you know these grapes, and those grapes really impact the flavor, you know. And then in sake, we have all these different rice varieties, and so sometimes what you see is people make these kind of one-to-one connections, right? So it's like, oh, you know, different rice varieties, you know, is going to make you know different sake. Um, And I think the easiest way to kind of understand it is that we have all these different varieties of rice, and certain styles of rice lend themselves to certain kind of styles of almost like fermentation, right? The way the structure of the rice, is gonna ferment. The way that even before that, when it's polished, you have rice, and then you polish it down, and just when the way that maybe you have to make koji, because for example, unlike whiskey, where you have the barley and you can malt it and you get enough of a sugary kind of raw ingredient, then when you add yeast, that'll eat, the yeast will eat the sugar and you'll make alcohol. For rice, we have to make koji to get a kind of enough sugar there that when we add the yeast, then we can do the alcohol conversion. So I think the important thing to think then about rice is that you can have like really maybe not the greatest rice in the world, but you can make a great sake with it. And for wine, I think that would be much harder. If you had like miserable grapes, it's kind of like you're screwed, right? But this, you can have rice. It's not really great rice, and you can make great sake with that. Why is that? Well, there's all these different steps during the brewing process. There's the yeast. There's how they do the fermentation, the different fermentation styles, all these different things. So that's really what makes sake, I think, a very, very human drink. That it's a reflection of the people that make it in a way that I think few beverages are. If we said that, for example, whiskey is going to be about 70% of whiskey is going to be the influence of the cask. That the cask has such a strong, during maturation, such a strong influence on whiskey. We'll say for wine, we'll say it's 70% of just the grape itself. We're not discounting the people that make the wine. I mean, they're incredibly important, but that grape itself is very, very important. But I'd say for sake, it's going to be about 70% is going to be the people, and so I think that's kind of the important thing. Other things that, like the hardness of water is going to impact the fermentation. There's all these other things. The way that they, the type of yeast starter that they make, all these things are going to kind of carry through in the final product. But it's really, going to be a reflection of the people that make it. And then the thing that's so interesting is that it's then kind of it's often then a reflection of their own palate, kind of what they eat, the foods that they like, and that sake, just because a certain sake is made in a certain region, doesn't necessarily it's going to taste a certain way. That's another big difference when we think about wine. That now when we think of like Niigata sakes, we think of them being very, very light. We think of them, having maybe a certain acidity to them, pairing very well with kind of fresher fish and these kind of lighter dishes. But it wasn't always that way. They were making these kind of much more heavier, robust, sakes 40, 50 years ago, because that's what was like popular. And the brewers then could change it. They could change the steps during the brewing process to reflect these different styles. And I think that that's kind of the thing that's really interesting. But sake is that it's very hard. It's a drink that's made from water. It's a drink that's made from rice. It's a drink that's made from yeast. These very, what we think of very simple ingredients, but it's incredibly complicated. Like the milling, just how much they polish away from the rice is going to impact the flavor. It can impact the flavor. It can give it more body often, and stuff like that. And so there's all these different steps. What yeast they use will impact the flavor. I mean, that's a huge impact on it. The kind of water that's being used, all these different things, all these steps along the way that the brewer says, I'm thinking about this sake and I'm gonna make these different steps. And that's what makes it fascinating to drink. And that's one of those things when you really get into it, it's you can spend your entire life learning about it and drinking it. And it's just endlessly fascinating.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's so fascinating. I think you said the it's a sake is a story about people, the people behind it who make it, and that's such a uh, poetic way to put it. Really amazing. But that leads me to my next question, actually, which is in doing your research for your book on sake. Did you have any barriers getting into some of the long-standing breweries in the country, and kind of getting that behind the curtains look at the process of how it's actually made?
Yeah, that's a good question because when I was, before I started the book, I'd been to a number of breweries, and everybody had been really nice, but I was always kind of like worried that there would be in Japan. You get either when you're interviewing people, you can get different kinds of weirdness sometimes, and one of the types of weirdness is you'll say, "I'd like to interview you," and then they'll say like, "Okay, but you have to show me uh, what you're going to write before it's published," and my immediate response is no. It's like I've never done that. I'm not going to do that. Sorry. I don't work that way. I'm happy to fact check it with you, to make sure all the data in it is correct. But I don't work for you. You're not my editor, kind of thing. So it's either that, or sometimes when you deal with corporations, um, you can ask what you can think are very kind of innocuous kind of questions like, I need this information, what is it? And that's not publicly disclosed. And then you have to like search through like old newspaper. It's like you're looking for how much something cost in, like, let's say 1932. How much did this product cost that you made then? Well, we can't tell you. And it's like, what? So you have to go back through old newspaper articles and find advertising, like silly stuff sometimes. So there's that. And then there's like, kind of gatekeeping on certain stuff. So I was kind of worried about that going into this. And I probably talked to, well over, well over 100 different breweries. And I maybe only had a bad experience once.
Wow,
That's great. That's great.
yeah.
And they were like super weird. And they were just, and it was just like, y'all are weird, so I can't go with you. But usually everyone was super, they wanted to tell you like what they were doing. And the sake industry actually was mired in a bunch of scandals, production scandals during the 1970s. And I think from that point, there were smaller breweries making sake that was being rebottled by the larger breweries. And this became a huge national scandal because people were buying one brand thinking they were getting one sake, but it was made by somebody else, right? And that kind of, in a way, blew the doors off kind of the industry, kind of really just like ripped it like open, like, and kind of like pulled back the curtain and then like tore it down, kind of thing, right? So generally I found that a lot of breweries are pretty open, as open as they can be, maybe if they don't want to, uh, 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 get too granular with kind of a production detail, right?
Yeah.
Um, um, and so I just found that people were incredibly generous with their knowledge and incredibly generous with their time. And I would, call, if I was doing a formal interview, I would call ahead, send the book kind of plan, and set up the interview that way, and then go visit them. But for a lot of breweries, I just kind of roll up, and I would just kind of like show up, and they'd see, okay, there's this foreigner guy here, and he's asking like incessant questions about sake. And if you can speak the language and you show like a real interest in their product, people are delighted. In the vast majority of cases, in my experience, were more than delighted to come and talk to you. And the coolest thing about sake compared to like other, say, because these are companies, compared to some other companies, would be, you have the brewery, and right next to the brewery there's a little shop. Well, the people working in the shop are often the family that own the brewery. So you can ask them questions and they know what's going on. Or sometimes the owner will come down. Sometimes the owner's in the shop. Sometimes the owner's making it as well. So it's this very intimate industry, which is, there's these connections through generations and families and kind of local connections as well that just make it utterly fascinating. So I actually didn't really run into that many problems. I thought it was going to be an utter nightmare. But I think maybe like one brewery was super weird, and then there was maybe like two others that were like, we don't allow people in, and they were polite about it. It's like, all right, that's fine. I love y'all sake, but
Yeah.
that's fine. Okay. So
That's great, because like I was curious because I was reading through some of the book, and you have a lot of stories in there, and I feel like those stories you had to like kind of get in the door and like kind of like talk to them and really get to know some of the owners or the employees of those breweries. Like for example, like one of the first stories in your book, and I'm not going to go into too much detail because I don't want to spoil it for too many people, but was about a Taketsuru brewery.
Yeah.
And how their son, or I guess the current owner,
yeah,
didn't want to be a sake brewer. He wanted to go into undo his own thing, but then felt kind of like a regret,
yeah.
knowing that like this brewery has been in the family for 2.5 centuries almost, and if it went under, it was because of him. So
Yeah.
he kind of felt that family, like I don't say guilt, but the duty to
The
take
duty,
it over.
exactly. That's it. The duty.
Yeah.
I mean, so for that interview, I spent all day with that guy.
Yeah.
And I've just found like that's when I when I worked on that book, when I was an intern on that book, that whole book was interviews, and so I saw people who were very good at interviewing, and the idea for interviewing is you just keep talking to people long enough that they just kind of open up and they just talk and you have a normal conversation. So whenever I go in to do an interview, I don't have a list of questions. I just kind of just go in and talk to them, and like kind of whatever happens, whatever it is. And so for those interviews like that, they just ended up being very organic. So it's just talking to somebody, listening to what they're saying. And
that's like the best thing, right? Like sometimes those unplanned conversations end up being more informative and more telling than a detailed, like, this is the question, this is the answer, formal setting.
Yeah. And so exactly. And so that's what I was really trying to do, and I wanted to do that. I wanted to parts of the book, I wanted them to be very intimate, like these stories with brewers or brewery owners, and then have these kind of like really deep dives, like historical stuff and cultural stuff throughout the book. But yeah, I mean, you spend a lot of time with these people, and they were just incredibly generous. I mean, that interview was incredibly.
That's great.
I mean, he was like saying stuff. I was like, wow, is that okay? Sorry about that. All right, I'm here.
We just met, but okay.
Yeah, keep going.
Yeah. So, I mean, prior to reading your book, I mean, I had, the knowledge of sake was literally just what was poured for me at like enkais or nomikais when I was at work parties or at a friend's house. So I,
Mhm.
despite living in Japan for 4 years, I don't have a refined palate when it comes to sake. I'm a savage. Um, when it comes to the different types, this book really kind of broke down all the different, whether it's the well polished types or the alcohol added types or the pure rice types. If you had to pick one, out of all of those, whether it's, just to have when you just on a day when you were like, you know what, I want to drink my favorite sake, like which type would you go with? It doesn't have to be a brand or anything necessarily, but like which style?
I tend to like so when we were doing the book, the gentleman Eguchi-san who did the tasting notes, we were trying to figure out like how to divide up sake. And so for the thing that I think is so hard for a lot of people to get into sake is like, first of all, you walk into a sake shop and there's a lot of Japanese, like there's kanji or
Yeah.
hiragana or whatever. And if you can't read it, it's super intimidating, right? So there's that immediate thing to contend with. Then there's a lot of jargon, and some of the jargon makes sense, and some of it's like, wait, what does that mean? I don't quite follow. So you kind of have to learn all this kind of stuff just to get into it,
Yeah.
and it's daunting, to be honest. And I think the easiest thing always to do is like when people are trying sake, it's more like just drink this, and if you like it, then we'll talk, kind of thing. And if you don't like it, well, I'll find something else. So the way that we ended up agreeing, the best way to kind of divide it up, at least for the tasting notes, was through body. Say if something is a light body, it's a medium body, or it's a full body sake. And then within that, you have all these different kind of production methods, which are then different styles. And the styles can be in each of the different body types, right? It can just depend. And so for me, typically the kind of sake that I like is very full flavored, very robust, stuff, that kind of stuff. I tend to just, if I'm going into a sake shop and I don't know what to drink, I tend to ask the person working there, the owner of the shop, what's the weirdest thing you have? And they're often like, oh, I've got something very strange for you, sir. And then they'll pull something out that's kind of, the production method is odd, or the fermentation or something like that. It's just unusual. So those are the ones that I like. I'm less of a fan of kind of like, lighter kind of watery ones. I just really like a lot of flavor in my sake. So that's what I would pick. But that's just kind of me. And then if somebody was saying like, well, I like, this is the kind of food that I like to eat, or these are the kind of, flavor, my flavor palette is like this, then it's easier to kind of recommend like, oh, this would be good, or that would be good, or you should try that. I do think that there's just a lot of things that kind of make getting into sake daunting. Sometimes like sake, if you look on the back of a sake label, I mean, sometimes it looks like a baseball card. There's like all these stats and all this numbers and all. It's like, what's this? So I think any way that we can kind of just break it down into something that's more digestible is just better for the consumers. And any time that we can kind of like, sake is a very flexible drink, and you can do a lot with it. You can serve it at a whole variety of temperatures and etc. And for me, I think that that's really kind of the great appeal of it. So for me, another thing is I always think about if I'm gonna buy something, or if I'm gonna drink something, I always think about the season. Okay. And so now it's kind of it's kind of wet and chilly here still, because we're in the rainy season. So I can still drink kind of warmed stuff, or stuff that's maybe slightly warmed. Room temperature is fine. But as we move into summer, I'm going to want more kind of unpasteurized stuff, fresher stuff. And so I think of sake being a really, really seasonal drink in an interesting way. I mean, I love whiskey, but if I'm drinking whiskey, it's neat. I'm always going to kind of drink it the same way. Maybe I'll have it on some ice, if it's a blazing hot summer day. But there's the kind of range of ways that I'm going to have it that serve are much more narrow. And so I think that's kind of the interesting thing to me about sake.
Yeah, and I mean, not to jump ahead, we had a question about when to choose between hot and cold versus room temperature, but I think that seasonal part really that kind of answered that question. It was, and you did break that down in the book too, like things that are available in the seasons and things that may be more, more appealing to people's palates at those times of year. So that's cool. I always think, and I kind of equated my first real sake brewery experience was going to one in Aizu-Wakamatsu in Fukushima Prefecture. Nice. I cannot remember the name for the life of me, but it was for a friend's birthday. We went there and had kind of a tasting. They gave us a tour, and it was if you've been to Aizu Wakamatsu in the winter, it's freezing, covered in snow.
Right.
So that was kind of one of my most memorable experiences with it at that point in time.
Mm.
And so just I always kind of equate with warm sake, kind of in a cooler, colder, temperature. That's how it syncs up in my mind.
Yes, it makes sense, right? I mean, it's
Yeah, yeah.
completely logical. Yeah, I mean, my favorite thing about so if you get a bottle of sake and the you just like if I've never had it before, I just want to start putting it through its paces. Like if it was like a sports car or something, it's like, all right, let's see what this thing can do. You know what I mean? Or if it was like some piece of like like equipment or whatever, it's like where is its kind of like where does it perform best? Where is it less so? So there are some sake that I just love at room temperature or warm, and I put them in the fridge and I pulled them out and I'm like, wow, this is not as good, and so I'll never drink them that way. So, but I'll know it's a chilly day. This would be good, and I can have it this way. But I think that just comes with as you have more and more, and you kind of build up a data bank in your brain about what you like, and then the way you like it served. You become more specific about it. But if it's something that I've never had, I'll just try it at all these different temperatures. So put it in the fridge, take it out of the fridge, get it to room temperature. The cool thing is in Japan, both of y'all probably know this, but like there's a setting on the microwaves that you can like heat sake, and that doesn't exist on American microwaves. So what you can do then is you can always just pour some in a coffee mug, and then just kind of zap that the microwave, and then drink it that way, or heat it up if you have a sake flask. You heat it up on heat up some hot water and then kind of put it in that, and you can play with different temperatures that way. But for me, that's kind of that's the appeal of it. And when I look at something like beer, I love beer. I love beer. But like there's you'll see people in the spring here during cherry blossom season, like drinking a bunch of cold beers, and they're like outside and the weather's still chilly and they're kind of like shivering. And these are obviously Japanese people, and you just want to go over to them and say like, I think warm sake would be much better now, but but that would be being bothering.
But that doesn't go with the blue tarps for Hanami, though. You need the crushed
Right,
cans and the blue tarps. That's the
right,
the
exactly.
Norogoshi.
Right, and that would be being a jerk and bothering people, so I don't do it. But yeah, I think that's kind of the best rule of thumb is look at the weather outside. Look at what you're eating. If it's cold outside, if you have sake, try to heat it up. It may be great. It may open up all these different flavors. Try it at all these different temperatures. That's kind of the fun of the drink. So I think that the more that we can move from this kind of very dogmatic style of thinking
Yeah.
to give people more confidence in the drink, where they feel comfortable with it and know that there are these kind of freedoms, and it's like, oh, you can't do this. It's like, well, that's nonsense. Do what you like, and then try these different things, and then you know you'll find something hopefully that you really really enjoy.
And just while we're talking about people making sake, is home brewing a thing? I know part of your book you mentioned they had a really hilarious story
Yes.
about a guy named Kawasaki who who was brewing his stuff, and he intentionally
Yeah.
he knew he was going to get in trouble and he just didn't care. Is it something where it's illegal to just brew and sell, or is it like, can you just not brew at all? Homebrew, if you get caught, you're in trouble.
So there are there's not in the U.S. there's a big kind of home brewing scene for beer, right? Because of laws here in Japan, kind of the only alcoholic drink that people can make at home where they're not going to get in trouble is going to be umeshu. And the reason is because you're buying already distilled alcohol, and then you're putting in the ume, and you're making it that way, right? So you're not actually making alcohol. So that's kind of because when they need to tax it. And so when you go to breweries and stuff like that, there is always a very acute awareness of the tax man, about alcohol taxes. I remember I was interviewing somebody once, and he got a call from the tax man. He's like, I got to go. He's like, I got to go talk to this guy. And so that's a very, very real thing. And so people, you can't legally, you have to have a license to brew, right? And so that guy's hilarious, because he's like, basically like, my grandma used to make this, and this is like making miso for this. This is just an agricultural product. We're farmers. This is what we have to make. And that pissed off the local authorities. And so they're like, we're gonna like get this guy. And he had to go to court and stuff like that. And he was such a pain in the butt about the court proceedings that the authorities were like, okay, we're just gonna, I mean, it seems pretty much at this point, they're like, we're just gonna ignore this guy. This guy is, and he's hilarious. That guy's really quite the character. But yeah, it's not like people are brewing stuff at home. One of the most interesting experiences I had in the book was going to a Shinto shrine, and they're brewing sacred sake. So they had this kind of one smaller shrine, and then they had the tank in there where they were brewing, and they were that sake was not going to be pressed. So a lot of the home kind of the home brewed sake, or the stuff that other man was making, it's not pressed, so it's not filtered, and you get this kind of like almost like kind of like a porridge, like an alcoholic porridge out of it. And so they were making that as a sacred sake. And the thing that was so hilarious is that my middle son, who I think he might have been like 6 or 7 then, he came along, and they are like, take the Shinto priest and the other older men who bring her, like, yeah, come in here. And so like my son's like sitting in there like brewing these or something like that. So I was like, yeah. So it's not like there isn't the home brewed scene as there is for beer. I mean, there isn't for beer here as well. I mean, so
we want to be respectful of your time. I know it's been about an hour, we appreciate every minute you've given us so far. So we want to just kind of maybe wrap things up. And first of all, thank you so much, and congratulations again on your book. It's amazing.
Indeed.
You already won an award for it. Congratulations on that. And do you have anything that you would like to share, or upcoming projects or works that you're working on that you like to promote, or if any messages to our international sake enthusiasts out there that are looking to get into the sake scene? Do you have any closing remarks for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely. I think internationally, just the more people that can get into sake and drink sake, and the more people enjoy it, I think is a really good thing. So I think any opportunity that people have to learn more is excellent. And another thing I would encourage people to do is, like, as I mentioned before, that a lot of really good sake is being made outside Japan. So if there's like if there's a brewery in your city or your state or your region of the country, please support them, because I think making sake in Japan is hard. I think making sake outside of Japan is even harder. There's just there isn't the same kind of infrastructure and institutional knowledge that has been accumulated over the centuries in Japan. So any kind of support that people, any support love people can show for their local breweries is great, because the more people can drink sake in a local setting, I think is ultimately good and even better for the drink, because then it kind of transcends. Like, people don't think of, oh, sake is just this Japanese thing. They think of it as being this very, it's like in Japan, nobody thinks of McDonald's as being this American thing. They think of it as McDonald's, it's like this, I'm going to go eat American. This is McDonald's, right? So I think sake can kind of reach a similar point. As for things that I'm working on, currently finishing up a French version of my book, Japanese Whiskey. So that's been interesting to do. And besides that, just trying to make it through the year.
I hear you, man. Aren't we all?
Yeah, same.
That's great. And I wish we would have had more time to talk about whiskey and sake and everything. I mean, it's been, I know there's so much to talk about that.
Yeah, well, definitely we'll have to get you back on if you're open to it for a whole episode on the whiskey process and the whiskey industry in Japan.
Nothing would make me happier.
Oh, music to our ears.
Exactly. And hey, we might have to all have glasses of whiskey with us.
I got a few bottles on my shelf downstairs, so I'll crack them open. I got like a Hibiki down there, Yamazaki 12 or 18, I don't know, but we got something from our family member for her wedding 5 years ago. So
wow, and it's been around for 5 years. Man, I don't know if that would make 5 minutes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, I can go on and on about that. Thank you so much again. Your book is wonderful, and I can't wait to talk to you soon about whiskey and other alcohol and just booze.
Right, yeah.
Next time we're in Japan too, if we're in the same area, we'll have to Kanpai it up.
Oh, definitely, yeah, and hopefully it's still before noon here, so hopefully if we do talk about whiskey, we can do it afternoon because
we could do morning time here and evening time there, and I'll just have an Irish coffee or something.
Yeah, it has to, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was great to talk to both of you.
Thank
there
you.
You go.
And that's it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for tuning into the Krewe Japan podcast. This week's episode is our second to last episode for season 1. So that means next week we're going to have a special season 1 recap episode. So make sure you tune in as we relive some of our most exciting experiences and comments and maybe even some bloopers from season 1. But for today we explore the world of sake with author Brian Ashcraft. Brian shared with us some great insight into what goes into the process of making one of Japan's finest alcoholic beverages, or just beverages in general. Are you a fan of sake? How do you prefer to drink it, hot or cold? Share with us some of your sake experiences with us on social media or to an email. We love to hear from you guys. So let us know how you thought about this episode, or, if you have some other ideas for future episodes, never hesitate to reach out. We're on Instagram and Twitter at Krewe of Japan Podcast. KREWEOFJAPAN PODCAST. Krewe of Japan Podcast. That's Instagram. Now Twitter is at Krewe of Japan. KREWEOFJAPAN. Whoop! And we got on Facebook too. Check us out there. Give us a like. Share our posts. I'm trying to up that Facebook game. So give us a share. Give us a like. Let your friends know. And especially with this episode, it came out fantastic. The interview is great. Let your friends know that we have great sake content on our podcast. So give us a follow at Krewe of Japan Podcast on Instagram and Twitter, as well as on Facebook. And if you need to reach us on email, I got that too. Krewe of Japan Podcast, KREWEOFJAPAN PODCAST @gmail.com. That's all for today. See you next time.